Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, I think we have another schmooze day. I can pretty well guess what we're going to talk about because we've not rehearsed, but we've met already before we got started. My two guests are both interested in military spending and military um, infrastructure and hardware and ethics. So we've got a whole range of potential conversations that we may steer off in the direction of. I think, Waterloo. Are you there, Tamara?
I'm in Waterloo.
Good. Tamara Lawrence is a longtime, a very zealot peace activist who has been working on issues of military spending and the effect of militarism on the environment and on climate change, as well as the ethical considerations involved in such matters. So Tamara has just finished an interview for the CBC and now has come over to talk with us. In Ottawa is Paul Mallet, who is a retired colonel in the Canadian military. And he got immediately to talking with Tamara about various kinds of airplanes that they're going to base in Cold Lake, Alberta, because he used to work there on airplanes and fighter planes. So I expect that these topics will come up. Let me start off by asking Tamara what you talked about to the CBC.
CBC just did an interview with me about the climate and environmental impacts of this war in Ukraine in the lead up to Earth Day, which is April 22nd. So there's a recognition that war causes, devastating environmental harm, and this has been something that has circulated on social media, for instance, and so they wanted to shine a spotlight on this problem, and they interviewed me. I am doing my academic research on the climate and environmental impacts of war and militarism. So that's why they reached out to me.
Yes, you know more about that subject than anybody else I know. In fact, I don't know anybody else who's even tried to do the research.
My research is looking at military emissions, the exemptions to military emissions in climate agreements and in environmental regulations, and the ethics around these excessive military emissions. I'm also looking at if and how countries might be trying to offset emissions from their military. So among all countries, the largest institutional consumers of fossil fuel, emitters of carbon emissions, are militaries. And when you look at, for instance, the Kyoto Protocol, there was an exemption for international bunker fuels used by the military. And if you look back even to 1972, the Stockholm Conference on Environment and Development, there's a long legacy of countries trying to exempt their military from environmental oversight and accountability. So that's the subject of my PhD, and I'm making the claim that if we're serious about the climate crisis, we need to hold one of the largest emitters of carbon accountable, and we need to start seriously considering the issue of demilitarization for decarbonization.
Ukraine is a fairly unique situation with regards to this. I would say that yes, the main environmental impact of war, in a sense, is not only tragic, but basically the sources probably are the biggest sources are the fossil fuel usage that they use in vehicles and aircraft, things like this. There are other environmental impacts in other wars. For example, in Afghanistan or whatever, there was the use of depleted uranium shells, 30 millimeter shells from such as the A-10 aircraft. But I don't believe that depleted uranium is being used in the Ukrainian conflict, which very, very serious risks to cancers and health issues. Certainly, there's the physical damage that's done and all the burning that goes on, and the residue from explosives that are put in the atmosphere. But probably the big one is the fossil fuel usage and the the physical damage with regards to environmental impact. Mm-hmm. And that's that would be my comment in that area.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just add to what Paul said, military vehicles like tanks, fighter jets, warships, they consume excessive amounts of fossil fuel. They're notoriously energy inefficient. And, we know that, for instance, Russia is using tanks. Canada has been overseeing a tank unit in Latvia. NATO forces have military forces throughout Eastern Europe. So the militarism of NATO has had adverse environmental impacts. And of course, Russia's invasion in Ukraine has devastating environmental impacts. And it is definitely the fossil fuel consumption, and also how this conflict is causing tension, and it's undermining countries wanting to work together on solving the climate crisis. Now there's more animosity between the West and Russia, but and China. But we're going to need to work with these countries to solve the climate crisis, other environmental challenges that we have. These are transboundary issues, and so conflict undermines cooperation, and that's a real concern as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like for example, there have been attacks on fuel farms, fuel depots. Great big massive fuel tanks have gone up, and this is millions of gallons of fuel or oil being put into the atmosphere. Not only that, recently the ship, the Moskva, that was attacked. I mean, it burned for a long time before it sank, and awful lot of smoke into the atmosphere. So there is all of these pollutants that are being put into the atmosphere for sure.
Well, that's one of the things that is pretty clear. I don't think anybody has even begun to win this war, and I don't think anybody will win it. But we sure have a loser already, and that is the peace movement, because it seems to me we have been really seriously defeated in our effort to prevent the war and to show the consequences that would happen if people actually use military force to settle a dispute of this kind. Because right now, instead of doing things like trying to clamp down on NATO or shut it down or reduce it or make it change its policies in any direction, the energy is very much directed toward increasing the weaponization of the whole world. Really, everybody wants to join NATO now. Everybody wants to send more weapons to Ukraine, and you can understand why they would. Because we don't have any other alternative for protecting those people. Those guys in Ukraine are sitting ducks and they're just waiting to be wiped out. And if they don't have weapons, I understand why they need them. And yet, it's completely contrary to everything we've been trying to do. We've been trying to say we can solve problems without increasing military expenditures or weaponization. And we have totally failed in making that case now.
Well, you're right, Meta. I think winning wars, the word winning wars is obsolete. I mean, I don't think we've won a war since World War II, which you could define as winning. I mean, the Vietnamese War was a mess. Afghan, Iraq, Libya, any of these wars you want to talk about. Even the Korean War has not had a ceasefire. So you're now in a culture when it comes to conflict or direct conflict of at the end of something that there is some accommodation that takes place. And that accommodation, usually will not be satisfactory to everybody. Matter of fact, will be likely satisfactory to nobody, but it'll be something that's going to reduce the violence. I mean, stopping the violence and the killing as a sort of a measure of some sort of cessation. So that's the kind of thing that we're in. And if you look at NATO, I mean, people are running to NATO because they think that the Article 5 is going to protect them. I mean, in order to protect them, I mean, Ukraine should not have needed an Article 5 declaration in order to get help. I mean, Libya, the attack that's happened in Libya and the NATO involvement in Afghanistan or whatever, these are not NATO countries under Article 5. These are, they don't merit that. So the reason that countries will go to war or whatever are political. I mean, these NATO agreements do not stand in the way of anything they wanted to do. And of course, in this particular Ukrainian situation, it's just the big specter of nuclear weapons in the background that made everybody hesitant. And they looked for kind of political ways to talk about this. So this is the situation we have. And at some point, there's going to be some accommodation, and it will. And we'll have to work it through. But my view of NATO right now is it needs to be massively reformed. I mean, you're not going to stop people creating alliances so that they can protect each other, because you've got the issue of fear, and Putin, President Putin there has put this into the conversation, and as a result, you've got Finland and Sweden, which did not join NATO, are now panicking, you know, to get applications in. Because they don't see any constraint here. So you've got all of these sort of circles, and then this just makes it all worse. I mean, then Russia now sees itself being encircled and expansion towards their borders and all of that, and you have a situation where it can't get better. There's no good outcomes here.
Right. Definitely. In fact, there's no even better outcome than what was already on the table and rejected. I mean, if you look at what the Minsk agreements called for, they're not going to do any better than that. I mean, Ukraine's not going to get a better deal in the long run than they already had in the Minsk agreement, which was not adequate, not satisfactory. No, I don't blame them for saying we don't want that. We don't want to comply with it. But at the same time, they're going to fight a war. They're going to destroy the whole country, and then what they'll come up with is not going to be probably significantly different from what's in the Minsk agreements.
So myself and many other people in the peace movement, believe that NATO should be disbanded, and its NATO expansion over the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War, its NATO provocations, NATO wars and interventions that have greatly contributed and caused this present war that we're seeing in Ukraine. In 2008, at the Bucharest at NATO summit, because of US pressure, the declaration from NATO was that Georgia and Ukraine were going to become, members of NATO. And this, violated a red line for Russia. And so for the past 14 years, we've seen, NATO forces moving more into Eastern Europe. We saw NATO forces like Canada under Operation Unifier since 2014, training Ukrainian security forces, arming Ukrainian security forces. This is very much provocative to Russia. Russia said to respect the neutrality of Ukraine, to not bring Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance. And this is something that Canada and other NATO allies, totally disregarded. We saw this war coming last fall. We were very concerned in the Canadian peace movement. I called 2 meetings in December with the Ukrainian peace activists. We met with Canadian activists over Zoom to try to plan out a strategy to, get Canada to be working with the international community to prevent an escalation, but Canada did the exact opposite. The Canadian peace movement in January released an open statement signed by by activists and academics and other leaders across the country calling on Canada to de-escalate, to support Ukraine neutrality, not to send military weapons, lethal aid to the country, to be an honest broker for peace and diplomacy. And Canada did the exact opposite. We also did a petition to the Prime Minister and to Minister Jolie to de-escalate. We had a number of national days of action in January and February, to prevent an escalation, like we've seen at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that was the OSCE, which was monitoring the Minsk agreements of 2015, that most of the shooting and shelling was from Ukrainian security forces in the West into the Eastern Donbass region. That is very evident from the daily reports and from the annual thematic reports. And this is something that also isn't recognized. Canada is complicit, and other NATO forces are complicit in boxing in Russia, putting Russia into a corner. This is something that we really need to be attentive to. We bear some responsibility for this war, and continuing to send weapons to Ukraine is not the right thing at all. NATO should have been disbanded, not reformed. It's NATO expansion and provocation that's really behind the current conflict that we see. We could have prevented this entirely if we respected Ukraine neutrality.
The terrible thing is, yes, we can make recommendations before a war happens, that if they pay attention to us, we peace activists are very smart and have good ideas, and we would solve all kinds of problems. I really think we would. But as soon as the war starts, all the recommendations that we have made become kind of moot. I mean, you can't tell those people in Ukraine now, yes, you made a mistake. You should have done this and this. You should have agreed to the Minsk Accords. Right now, they're in a situation where that clearly the Russians are attacking them and will not just back off. So what do you do now? That's the terrible thing. When you get into a war situation, peace activists have almost nothing to offer.
Well, Canada should be calling for a ceasefire and a political resolution.
Oh, of course we want a ceasefire, but you might as well, yes, tell the ocean to stop sending tides in. Go ahead, tell them to do a ceasefire. Right now they're not going to, and you know it. So what do? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to be a little bit cautious here, and we have to certainly look at the root cause of this. I mean, I certainly agree that when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, that NATO should have dissolved in respect of that. But that would not have precluded the formation of the European Union. Mm-hmm. And the path of Ukraine seems to be to go into the European Union, where even though they may not have NATO-like provisions against violence, they do have an understanding that that there is some obligation here, and that they would have done so, regardless of whether there was NATO or European Union or whatever. You look at the root cause. Now, certainly, expansion is something that is being used, I think, by Russia to justify this. This is the political sort of persona they're putting out here. Mm-hmm. we dissolved, you're expanding. I think it's a little deeper than that. I think what you have is an issue of when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, Russia suffered a great humiliation, and this humiliation is now coming to its head, in the person of Putin. Mm-hmm. And he, regardless of this NATO expansion argument, he was moving into Georgia and various countries, Chechnya and whatever, trying to reclaim what he calls, the Russian or the motherland kind of thing, and the countries that he feels belongs to that. And so he may have continued this aggression regardless of what NATO is doing or not. From a Machiavellian point of view, this person is quite the operator. So,
Paul, at the end of the Cold War, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved, there were agreements made. This is in the US National Security Archives. There's a plethora of statements that have been made that NATO would not expand to Russia's border. And NATO has expanded to Russia's border. And this has been very provocative to Russia. There are repeated annual exercises, nuclear weapons exercises, air policing from NATO up by NATO fighter jets up and down Russia's border. This is very provocative. It's very dangerous. It's very destabilizing. It's undermining security between Europe and Russia. There's no way the United States, for instance, would tolerate Russian bases along its borders in Canada or in Mexico. I mean, we have to. We have to recognize the real security concerns that Russia has by NATO expansion to its borders. And the other thing that we need
that is the argument, and that's also the Russian argument. And I totally agree. In my time in the military, flights of aircraft were happening both ways, all up and down the Canadian seaboard. That's my job. A part of fighter group was to intercept these aircraft. So there has been that, and I do agree that bases close to the Russian border were not helpful. I do know that we made a huge mistake. A huge mistake was made, similar to the mistakes made after World War I and World War II. After World War I, we elected to crush Germany. After World War II, we elected to rebuild Germany and Japan into functioning democracies and economies. After the Warsaw Pact collapsed, we elected to not be helpful in bringing Russia into the entire, even NATO. We allowed them to establish a committee or a group within NATO to try to build confidence with regards to these things. Now, what we run into, of course, is the issue of fear in these countries like Latvia or whatever. You've got to ask yourself, is it a question of us expanding into these countries, or is it a question of them being fearful of being overrun again by Russia and seeking some measure of security? Now, I'm familiar with the statements by Baker and things like that. Not an inch will we go forward to Gorbachev and these kinds of things. And you're absolutely right in that. And whether that actually creates fear in Russia or it creates the provocative argument, for what they want to do now, there's a little bit of both in here. And I think we're not categorically responsible on one side. What's happening is it's two people dancing here. And I remember once after the Cold War finished, I was in the Pentagon, and there was some military officers in there, and we were in a mess or some function there, and some naval officers were upset. And the idea being was, one of them says, well, what's the problem here? He says, well, the Russians are not keeping up their end of the threat, because they had this accommodation and this great game going on, which was a big adventure sort of thing. Chasing each other around the oceans and whatever, and there was this thing going on, and now it all collapsed, and now it's trying to seek some rebalancing sort of thing. And unfortunately, you've got a reincarnation of Stalin or Hitler or something like that who took charge. I mean, look at how close they could have come with Trump, for example, in the United States, if he had made some real crazy decisions. Well, here we have it. Crazy decisions being made.
Well, Paul, I would like to say it's not two parties dancing. We've got Russia on the one side with a military budget of about $61 billion, and we have NATO, a military alliance of 30 Western countries with a combined military budget of about $1.1 trillion. I mean, this accounts for about 65% of global military spending. So these are not two equal partners, in a kind of an aggressive dance at all. I mean, this is why Russia very much feels under threat. And Russia is aware of what NATO has done, totally destroying Afghanistan. That was a devastating war in Afghanistan that and the devastating war and occupation by NATO in Iraq, and the devastation, the civil war now that we see in Libya. Was Canada that led the NATO bombing in 2011. And so Russia is very concerned about what NATO, and especially the United States, which dominates and dictates NATO, is capable of doing. And we know, for instance, in January, that Canada sent special forces to Ukraine. There's no parliamentary or public oversight of what Canadian special forces are doing right now. We've sent more soldiers to the region in Poland and in Latvia. We have an electronic warfare unit that was moved into Eastern Europe. What is that doing? We know that that NATO is behind the Ukrainian security forces, arming and doing the surveillance and targeting. A French journalist was recently in Ukraine and admitted that it's the Pentagon, it's NATO that is really behind what Ukraine is doing, and that this is a NATO proxy war that's taking place in Ukraine. The other thing that I want to add is
I would not use that term.
Well, the former Secretary
I agree with you in a lot of the things you say. I'm just being careful not to monetize this, because we do outspend them by a factor of 10. You're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right that Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a lot of problems with that with regards to the laws of armed conflict. They did not have the just cause and whatever under the laws of armed conflict to do what they did. And you're right. Once the Warsaw Pact collapsed, superpowers began to act with impunity. In other words, there was this disregard for the national order, and the United States does not sign on to the ICC or the ICCJ. But on the monetization side of it, as an argument, what we have found, to follow up on my argument about war being obsolete, is that a superpower can be defeated by AK-47s and small arms, and they have proven this now again and again. Insurgencies and very, very light forces know how to defeat superpowers. The Taliban, for example, in Afghanistan, and for all the wreckage that happened in Libya, you've got this failed state, and Iraq is probably not much better, but certainly in Vietnam they should have learned the lesson right then and there that small insurgencies can defeat you in the long run. So you're looking at Ukraine now, and you're saying, well, Ukraine, if we accept that Ukraine's a sovereign country, it can make sovereign decisions. So it could have decided to let the Russians in, for example, at the beginning of this incursion there, because I'm pretty sure the literature seems to point out that that's what was expected. They thought they would just roll in with this 120,000 people, and everybody would knuckle under, and that you would have to have a different kind of accommodation, similar to, for example, the Danes in World War II. They accepted the Germans, then they went into passive resistance. The Germans did not destroy the country because they wanted the shipbuilding capacities and whatever. So they wanted to build warships. As they started to build warships, they found the people working there found every different excuse you could have, from supplies to this to technical issues or whatever, to delay this. And by the end of the war, they had not built one single warship. And it's well known that if you were going to take Ukraine, which is a population of 40 million people, you could not occupy it, with less than 1 million. And don't forget, 150,000 troops. Of that, let's assume you take a 3-to-1 ratio. Only 1/3 of it are combat troops. So now you're talking 30,000 or 50,000 people to occupy a country of 40 million. It's just not militarily possible. Not in a heartbeat would you get anywhere. So the question being there is, let's just do the thought experiment. If that had happened, you're probably talking, 5,000 lives saved right now. All of these cities reduced to rubble, in a nonviolent path. If we're a peace movement, we have to be very careful about saying, okay, let's justify the killing, or allow the killing to be justified. This is an incredibly last resort. that one should accommodate to now. A proxy war, okay, if you want to call it that, you can, but I don't believe that the intent of the involvement of the countries protecting Ukraine is a war against Russia. It's a war. It's a defensive thing to help Ukraine, and there's a distinction between that. Are we fighting Russia or are we helping Ukraine? I know they both come together at some point, but there's a careful distinction, because if you're declaring war on Ukraine through another country, for example, Iran is arming the Yemenis and the Saudi, and the Americans are the Saudis, and they're fighting in Yemen. So you've got that kind of tension there. I'm not sure you've got that, but the war in Ukraine does have this great big geopolitical effect, and all of these tensions come on board. And I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that that the things you're saying are very important, and there is something to them, but they're all part of a bigger context. And as a peace professional and the services I work with, one has to be very careful. Are you going to say I'm pro-West, pro Ukraine, and against Russia? Well, you're taking sides. You have to be pro-peace, and so you have to be in a position to be able to talk to Russia and to talk to the Ukrainians and do something that's going to have the objective of peace. Like a judge in a courtroom, for example. You don't come in with a very, very strong bias against the accused, the axe murderer, whatever it is. You have to be impartial, put your fixed views aside, and try to create peace. Rather than getting into the blame game. If we're going to blame the United States, how are we going to talk to the United States? If we're going to blame the Russians, then what? And all I'm trying to get at is the role of the peace movement, or the role of the people who are involved in peace services, and how to delicately walk that middle path, for example, that's going to be able to accommodate all the tensions and sides that are in the situation, and try to make something peaceful about it, I guess, in the long term. Now, this is going to be horrifically different. Difficult. The hatred that's building up here is going to be generational.
Yeah.
And even in Russia, oh gosh, what the politics in Russia against Putin now? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. Are we going to have another, somebody hanging from a lamppost here, like Mussolini or something, at the end of this? And then how do they recover a global, becoming a member of the global community again? And
I just love what you said, Paul, and I'm really on your side. At the same time, what I wonder is, can we? I think everybody would say right now the best we could hope for is some kind of ceasefire negotiated solution. But starting right from where we are, rather than looking at who's to blame for how we got here, because there's enough blame to go around for everybody. But starting with where we are as a predicament. What is the most promising way in which we can induce people to actually reach any kind of ceasefire in any kind of agreement? Do you see? That's where I am stuck thinking we've got to think of an answer. And I have no idea, nothing promising. Do either of you have an idea of not looking at the past and how we got here, but what to do now to make it the best opportunity to end this thing?
Well, unfortunately, the number one reason that these things would end is exhaustion. Both sides are doing what's called a drawdown in a military sense, and at some point, if you love the land more than you love your children, you've got your problem. So exhaustion usually is the number one problem, the inability just to support the thing, and the sheer horror of it all. And number two, of course, is going to be some collective global response, and I think it has to be through the UN. We can't rely on this NATO Russia politics sort of thing. The global community has to step in. But don't forget.
Okay, how can the UN do it? Could the UN General Assembly say, okay, Security Council, you can't do a thing, we will?
Well, there is provisions in the Security Council for doing things like that. Unfortunately, the Security Council is not, the Security Council or the UN is not a world government. It doesn't maintain a police force. What it can do is it make resolutions, and amongst these resolutions, it's the consensus coalitions of the willing that are kind of empowered to carry them out. So if some people don't want to, and if it elevates to the Security Council, of course, then there's the veto process. My view of the Security Council, of course, would be either to abolish it or, make it a majority sort of decision-making place, or something like this. But the Security Council is an impediment right now to global governance in a sense. And the UN, in my view, is almost a perfect democracy, almost. In other words, everybody, all countries are sovereign, and they all have a vote, and they all have a decision what they're going to do. Nobody is going to impose their will on them. So, and unfortunately, we have the situation we have now, which not much gets done. Some of the important things can get done. I mean, the humanitarian aid can start. I mean, I don't know why our Canadian contribution would be to if we're going to send troops or things in there, to do it in terms of safe havens, protect refugees, refugee camps, areas where the military activity is kind of prohibited. And
well,
of course,
I'd love that idea if it were feasible, but I wonder if you have people bombing, and in fact, think of that theater where everybody was in the basement and they had the big sign saying the children here, and they bombed it anyway. If you have that kind of thing going on, I don't know what could a safe haven look like? You can't defend them.
Well, it could be an area somewheres, maybe in the east or something like that, where people could go that are defendable. That you could put
the bombers when the bombers come in with, to bomb the thing. I don't know how you can defend against that unless you have what they're talking about. No-fly zones, and then you have the Russians saying, well, we'll use our nukes on you if you do that.
You're not going to have no-fly zones. There's no reason you couldn't have air defense weapons. You couldn't have, S-300 air-to-air batteries, things like this. You want to fly over here, military aircraft, you are going to be subject to enforcement from the ground. I mean, that all leads to what you police your own airspace, and you're not an aggressive force kind of thing. I mean, we have policemen in this country that do certain things. There's no reason that cannot have a safe haven peace operations. Call it a peace operation.
Really, has it ever been done? I mean, I've never heard of an air defense of a safe haven. In fact, I don't know anything about safe havens much at all. Where has such a thing ever been attempted?
Well, there's an actual book, that goes through all of these things, all the places. I think I've got it somewhere here.
Huh.
Yeah, the book is called Zones of Peace, and how to create safe havens and things like this. And It's got all the example, sanctuary, zones of peace in, Aden and places like this.
Oh,
Philippines,
okay.
Whatever.
But that sounds like a terrific topic for a book, because I didn't know there was such a book. Yeah. Tamara, I've been monopolizing the conversation, so you please jump in.
In many ways, Ukraine, was a zone of peace and neutrality that Canada and NATO did not respect. So there were the Minsk agreements, of 2014 and 2015, the package of measures that said, for instance, no foreign forces and no foreign weapons. Canada and other NATO forces, were in Ukraine training Ukrainian security forces, some of them extreme, right-wing, neo-Nazi, violent fascist forces within the Ukraine military. And this violated the Minsk agreements. The other thing is, the United States, supported a coup in the country in 2014, and that US-backed administration under Poroshenko withdrew neutrality from Ukrainian constitution. If Canada and other NATO forces had respected the Minsk agreements and respected neutrality, we wouldn't be seeing this war by Russia in Ukraine right now. Neutrality was in the constitution of Ukraine, and it was removed in 2019. And Russia repeatedly asked for NATO to respect Ukrainian neutrality. The other thing is, I would like to respond to some earlier remarks that Paul made, and I want to emphasize that the peace movement that I'm in Canada, rejects all war and violence. And in January, when we released our open letter and petition calling for de-escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, we launched a campaign that said, stand for peace, not stand with Ukraine. We didn't want to pick sides. And as a Canadian peace activist, I'm holding my government, Canada, accountable for what it's doing, to foment this conflict and to extend it. And I think it's also really important to look at the monetary aspect of this. It serves NATO's interest for permanent war to take place. Our economies, Canada's and especially the United States, is highly militarized, and we make a lot of money, selling weapons and engaging in warfare, in these military interventions. And people also need to recognize the fact that one of the reasons why NATO continued to exist at the after the Cold War is because in the mid-1990s, there was a body that was established, led by the U.S. weapons manufacturers. It was called the U.S. Committee to Expand NATO, and it was led by Lockheed Martin executives, Norm Augustine and Bruce Jackson, and they put pressure on the U.S. Congress to expand NATO into Eastern Europe, into the former Warsaw Pact countries, because they saw these countries as being new markets for American weapon systems. If a country is a member of NATO, it needs to be interoperable, especially with the United States, which has always commanded NATO. And you need to buy American weapon systems. NATO really serves as a market especially for U.S. weapon systems. And so this war has been extremely profitable for U.S. weapons manufacturers. We saw in March all of the stocks for Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, L3, Raytheon all go up, up to 20%, because of this war. So the U.S. government, other NATO countries are profiting a lot for this, this terrible war that's causing so much death and destruction. And we need to be held accountable. Canada needs to think, very seriously about how it's profiting from selling all of these weapons to Ukraine. And in fact, that's impoverishing the country. The last thing that Ukraine should be spending on, it's a poor country to begin with, is buying new weapon systems. Canada should have done everything that it could to de-escalate the conflict, to call for a ceasefire, and not to sell weapons.
Well, you're absolutely right. I believe certainly that war is not the answer, and I certainly believe that the military-industrial complex is well, not only complicated but takes advantage of all of this. There's no doubt about that. War profiteering is well known in all conflicts. On the side of Ukraine, we do at the end of the day have to grant them some agency. I mean, I was in part of OSCE in 3 missions in Ukraine. The last one dealing with election support in which Poroshenko won, and the previous 2. So during the Maidan and the takeover of Crimea, all of those things happened, in that election and the previous 2, and certainly the country for a decade was having problems with the separatist groups in the in the Donbass region and the Luhansk region. And even the last mission I had was in the Zaporizhia, right down there. And I could, they gave you 29 villages to visit and help set up and all of that kind of thing. And you drove all around the countryside, but you got the pulse of the people, and the pulse of the people was, of course, they did not in any way, especially in the Russian areas that I was in, want to have anything to do with Russia. And there was a sort of a climate of fear there.
Just a sec. I want to make sure I understand there. But in Zaporizhia, the Russian speakers did not want to have anything to do with the Russian position. Is that what you're saying?
I drove into a little town once, and they had a billboard about 20 feet by 20 feet with a big picture of Putin with a Hitler mustache. And I could show you that picture. And, all I could say is, if the Russians ever roll through here, you got yourselves big problems. Mm-hmm. And but they were adamant. I would say that I don't know how big the separatist movement is, but once it got militarized, and it got militarized by a lot of Russian weapons. And to take your point, Tamara, is Ukraine. There's no Ukrainian weapons in there. Most of the weapons in there are Russian, and now they are Western in a sense, because when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, they retained all the Russian, even though they did have a tank factory and things like that, but built Russian weapons. So I completely believe, but there's a lot of blame to go around, a lot. And my view of what Poroshenko was he was known as the candy man. I mean, he made his rich off chocolate factories, and some of them were in Russia. He was the chocolate man kind of thing, but he was better than the previous one, and the pictures that I have of the Maidan there and everything that happened there, and the shootings and the roadblocks, this country just didn't come to war here. It's been at war for decades anyway. So there's a lot of complicated things that cause this, and I would be very reticent to start blaming one side or the other. There's enough blame to go around here in all different ways. I mean, look at the takeover of the Crimea. I mean, how can you justify that? I mean, the Crimeans were originally the Tartars, which were ethnically cleansed, and brought in by Russian speakers. And one has to be very careful as to where one's sympathies lie when one tries to talk on behalf of Ukrainians, because it's very, very mixed and very.
Paul, yeah, I am not saying at all that I am speaking on behalf of Ukraine. I am concerned as a Canadian peace activist about Canada, and Canada as a member of Nato, of how it's contributing to tension and causing conflict in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in North Africa. I
agree with you, Tamara. I totally agree with you there.
So just a couple of things here. NATO has fomented the ethnic divisions in Ukraine. Canada and other NATO forces have been arming and training anti-Russia Ukrainian security forces, and especially the extreme ultranationalists that are, against Russia. 20% of Ukraine identifies as ethnic Russian, and they need to be part of the political apparatus. Instead, we've seen laws pass in Ukraine under Poroshenko, for instance, that and under Zelensky, that where the Russian language could not be used at school. Just to also say about Poroshenko, Canada and the United States and NATO, backed Poroshenko. He was pro-NATO, and he was pro the European Association Agreement. Both of those things were not in Ukraine's best interest, because it undermined peace and neutrality, and it fomented conflict with Russia. The other thing is, are you aware of the RAND report? RAND is, funded by the Pentagon. In 2019, RAND released a study called overextending and unbalancing Russia. There has been a plan in place to try to destabilize Russia. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is part of that. And Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, said in an interview 2 weeks ago that what is really taking place is a NATO proxy war against Russia. And this has been long in the making. And why is that? Because the pipelines into Europe are from Russia. They cross through Ukraine and Belarus. The United States and Canada and other NATO countries want to control Russian oil and gas. That's a source of Russian power. And, Russia being the largest country on the planet has incredible natural resource wealth. And, we have our eye on that. I mean, we need to be serious about what's going on.
I totally agree that the Cold War mindset and the competition that went on there, is still working its way out. Yeah, absolutely right. Seeking advantage. And we're making the mistake that we made in World War I, where we crushed the Germans, and that presaged World War II. Now, all of the pipelines and whatever, and there's no end of talk. Of course, RAND reports are on everything. Now, whether there's an actual plan or whatever it is, I don't know. I haven't seen it, but actions seem to say something. And Canada's role in all of this, I do agree that training people to kill people is not peacemaking or peace operations or anything like this, because you have no idea all of that training and all the weapons that you're giving them, whether they're going to be used to oppress people or to defend the sovereignty of the country. Now, what Poroshenko did was he exercised as the elected representative of Ukraine, the necessary agency that people can do. Look at withdrawal of neutrality and treaties and ABM treaties and everything like that. Countries go in and out of that stuff like water, and they join a treaty one day and cancel it the next. The United States is famous for that, and Russia's famous for that. As long as it suits their purpose or your purpose. So you have to grant them the agency to at least say, what is in the best national interests of Ukraine, and to say, I don't agree. I don't think it's in their best interest. But, whose decision is it, for Canada to say things like that? Now, I would totally agree that, arming people and whatnot as a way of building peace and security and whatnot has its severe problems. It's not the way to go. If we took $1 billion out of the defense budget and put it into peace operations, like true peace operations, we would probably get more out of this and change our role in NATO to one of peace operations. We want nothing to do with offensive military operations, and we will be the person that everyone can talk to, and we will do the necessary peace operations that are possible and that a military can do, to everything from disaster response to environmental issues to, security in places where they need security. But it has to have that definition, and it has to begin with the premise of nonviolence. So once you start there, then foreign policy should flow out. But Canada has a huge interest in military. Look at the arms they're selling to Saudi Arabia. This is unconscionable if you're going to look at the death and destruction that has caused, in the Yemen war. So we as a country have to have this discussion, of which you're having it and I'm having it, and we're going to move forward. But at the end of the day, we're going to elect people, and they're going to do things, and that defines who we are. And maybe we're a little tired of being that. My view of NATO is that it's just so big and so powerful that I was hoping that the EU would form itself as a counterweight and have its own defense and security things, and that NATO would just kind of melt away. If Latvia wants to join the EU or whatever it is, but NATO seems to have that incredible resilience there that the military-industrial complex is not shy about feeding at any point. And that's what we have to address. So I would rather be a force for peace and reform, a real force for peace and reform in NATO, rather than let them go along this toxic path that they seem to be going along.
The reason I really favor what you're saying, Paul, is because I myself feel so aggressive. I really want Ukraine to win. I really want bad things to happen to Russia. Now, I look at myself and I say, what kind of person are you? You're supposed to be a peace worker. And the truth is, this is where it's come for me. It's really, I really feel sorry for the people in Ukraine. And I really feel disgust for the people who support Putin. Now, what I know in my head I need to do is make some sort of switch to where I can see in terms of how do you give this guy a way out? Putin has made a stupid mistake. Even he must know it by now. Or if he doesn't, everybody else in Russia probably does in their heart of hearts. So how are you going to give him a way to back down without, well, he's just not, that's not his character to back down. But can we, in anything that we say or do, give him a way out? And could we even give people in running the NATO operation a way of switching gears to where they want to do what you're suggesting, do protection for safe havens or something, which is something I would love to. That's a good solution. How can we give people an off ramp?
Well, just a really quick statement. There is a statement in military parlance, Chinese statement, I think. You have to give your worst enemy a golden bridge. In other words, you have to give them a way out. And what is happening now, we haven't seen the worst of it yet, because on the other side of the coin, it's the harm being done to NATO, to Ukrainians. What about the harm to Russia? We are crushing the ruble. We're tanking the ruble, and we're in the process of crushing their economy. Just wait till all of that starts. The famines and whatever, and the way out, for Putin may well be his head, but that just might be the stark, brutal reality of it all.
Oh boy! Well, Tamara, you get the last word, and then but make it a quick word, and try to make it an upbeat word if you can.
Well, if we want an end to this war, we could make some compromises. Canada and other NATO countries, we could pull back. We could stop sending weapons. We could, express our willingness to support a negotiated political resolution to the crisis. I really liked what Paul said about our foreign policy should be premised on nonviolence and peace. We need to change course in this country and have our values guide the actions that we're taking in the world. Instead, we see this very aggressive militaristic approach. And, Canada should change course because it's not working. It's causing more death and destruction. And we should be, helping to build a new security architecture in Europe that brings Russia in. There is an apparatus in place, and it's something that Paul pointed to, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. The Helsinki Act of 1975 includes all European countries and Russia. It provides that security architecture, that can help, build peace in Europe.
We all agree, absolutely. I think on that one we could say, turn everything over to the OSCE and everything will be happy. So, but we're over time now. So, yeah, thank you both. It's been a very stimulating, difficult issue, and bless you. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you, Meta.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode 439. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. We want you to contribute to those conversations. To find a particular talk show to watch or listen to, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've listened or watched, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. I'll see you there.